Konnichiwa and greetings from the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Andrew Phillips. I'm an Associate Professor in International Relations and Strategy, and it is my great pleasure to be discussing with you virtually today the topic of how Asia goes to war, Indo-Pacific rivalry in the Asian century. Through the magic of Zoom, I'm now about to share my presentation to you and look forward to discussing this fascinating topic. So to give you a sense of what I'd like to cover in this presentation, really four themes. The first is looking at the foundations of American power in East Asia, and specifically looking at this question of how it is that the United States has, since 1945, secured international security in the East Asian region, and how that has in turn produced a degree of stability within that order. The second thing that I'd like to do is to very briefly canvass some of the deep forces that are now beginning to transform the international system and making the originally American-dominated security order there increasingly hard to sustain. Third, and of most urgent consequence, I'd like to address the possibility of how it is that Asia might go to war. We live in a fascinating and at the same time deeply concerning period of history where we are seeing the displacement of an older security order that has maintained a delicate balance of peace between great powers for quite some time and shifting to a more fluid and dynamic order in which the possibility of great power war has become all too plausible. So what I'd like to do is to discuss three different scenarios in which that possibility of war might materialise. And then finally, what I'd like to do at the very end of the presentation is to canvass certain scenarios about how Asia and Asian great powers might manage the transition to a more stable international order. I am nerdishly excited about international security, and I hope very much to convey some of that excitement to you in the next few minutes. But to begin, what I'd like to do is to look at the foundations of the US security system in Asia. And what I would like to suggest when people think about the international system, when people think about international security, there's a tendency to focus exclusively on military power. The United States still spends more money than any other country in the international system in developing its military. It has a carrier strike group, for example, based permanently in Japan. Military power is an indispensable part of the United States' arsenal of influence in East Asia. That said, it's a multi-dimensional order that the United States has established that I would suggest rests on four key foundations. The first of those is what's known as the hub and spokes alliance system within East Asia. From August 1945, with the end of the Pacific War, the United States was the dominant actor in this part of the world. European colonial empires persisted for a time, but were rapidly dissolved by the mid to late 1950s. And instead, what we see is the emergence of a security system based on a series of bilateral alliances, with the United States at the core and other states being spokes within that system. So a series of bilateral alliances. The United States' most important alliance within the region is its alliance with Japan, which is referred to as the linchpin for international security within the East Asian order. In addition, though, the United States also has alliances with Australia and New Zealand, and also with Thailand and the Philippines as well. So from the early 1950s, the United States has projected influence throughout the region with a series of alliances, very different to the equivalent in Europe, where the United States is part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in that these alliances were all bilateral in character. We're beginning to see a bit of cross-bracing between those alliances, greater cooperation, for example, between Japan and Australia. But this has generally been the pattern of US power for most of the post-war period. The second element, as I've already adverted to, is that the United States remains preeminent in the international system in its ability to project power militarily at a global scale. If we look at the Pacific Ocean, it's the largest geographic feature within on this planet, and yet the United States is able to reliably project power across its expanses. The way that it's able to do that is in part because of the fact that it has large forward-based military deployments of soldiers and materiel in places like Japan, in places like South Korea. It also has a variety of smaller bases in areas such as the Philippines and other treaty allies such as Australia. Significant to mention also this, though, up until very recently, and in fact even continuing to now, is the United States providing a nuclear umbrella for its allies within the region. Again, to cite a few historical examples here, Japan has all of the military, industrial and technological requirements to be a nuclear power should it choose to do so, but the United States, in return for Japanese restraint, has provided a nuclear security umbrella for them. Likewise, South Korea in the early to mid-1980s sought to develop its own nuclear capability, and the United States discouraged them from doing so, providing their nuclear umbrella in exchange. What's notable about this is that if we look at the Asia-Pacific region, particularly if we look at Northeast Asia with powerful allies such as South Korea and Japan, these are countries that could easily have nuclear capabilities. The fact that they do not has been raised by many as an example of the way in which the United States security posture has stabilised rivalries within the region. The diplomatic and the military elements of US power are the most obvious, but two other elements that are worth noting are the economic and also the ideological foundations of United States power in the Asia Pacific. So the economic level, what's really evident at the economic level is the degree to which the United States from the 1940s through to the 1990s at least maintained a posture within the region that said that they would be open to the exports of their junior allies, and that this would serve as a major catalyst for industrial development and the growth of prosperity within the region. What we're beginning to see very rapidly on the economic front is that China is beginning to displace the United States as both the primary customer and also a key investor in many Asian states. But a key element of United States power really up until the present has been this role of economic hegemon throughout the region. And the final element are the ideological foundations of US power that the US since 1945 has, with varying degrees of consistency, admittedly, promoted ideas of nationalism, capitalism and democracy throughout the region. What's notable is that this has been, and at times, very inconsistent commitment. So up until the mid-1980s, the United States staunchly supported the Marcos regime in the Philippines until popular resistance led to the overthrow of that regime in 1986. What we've seen during this period also is the shift in a country like South Korea from being a military dictatorship to being a democratic state. The United States has often been compromised and limited in its promotion of democracy, but nevertheless that has been a consistent effort on the part of the United States increasingly to encourage democracy and capitalism as foundations of the Asia-Pacific order. The broad point to take out of this is that the United States' role in the region is multidimensional. It rests on a strong diplomatic foundation in its alliances. It is underwritten by the United States' traditional role as being militarily supreme within the region. And it has important economic and ideological underpinnings that are admittedly beginning to fray in the contemporary era. So what I've done there is to give you a broad sense of the foundations of the US security system in Asia. Many people ask what role has the United States played within the region? Indeed, what role has it played globally? What have been the benefits that US power has provided to the Asia Pacific? What I'd like to suggest is that particularly from the 1970s onwards, as the Vietnam War was beginning to wind down and tensions between the United States and China were beginning to ease off with a diplomatic rapprochement between those two countries, there are really three core ways in which the United States has provided a degree of stability in the region. So how has the United States, how has American power contributed to regional order? Well, I'd suggest three ways. The first of these is what the Australian strategist Hugh White has referred to as the double reassurance. And the idea behind this is to say that Japan and China have had an extraordinarily complicated and extremely tense historical relationship. If we look at the end of the Pacific War, and particularly from October 1949, the emergence of a communist regime in mainland China, there has been a great degree of security mistrust and rivalry between China and Japan. From the period of 1972, and particularly from 1979, when the United States normalised its diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, it was said that the United States provided a degree of stability in the Sino-Japanese relationship through the provision of what was understood as a double reassurance. And that is, while Japan remained a junior ally of the United States, while Japan retained a commitment, for example, to the peace clause in its constitution, that the United States would essentially keep Japan as a constrained and peaceful power, thereby reducing the security anxieties that China itself felt. And likewise, that Japan would not face an incentive to develop a military capability commensurate with its economic capabilities because of the reassurance that the United States played in pacifying China in that relationship. So there's a sense of saying that the two greatest powers within Northeast Asia were not reconciled in the period from the 1970s to the present, but that for a period of time at least down to the early 2000s when the United States relationship with China began to deteriorate, that this was a stabilising role. The second element is the significance of US power as a conventional and nuclear deterrent to aggression within the region. An illustration of this is the United States' role within the conflict in South Korea. The United States, or rather the Korean Peninsula, I should say. The United States has played an important role there to the extent that the forces that are deployed in South Korea serve as a tripwire of sorts that guarantees United States intervention should North Korea attack South Korea with a conventional military strike. So there's a sense of saying that there's been a degree of peace within the region to the extent that the United States has provided a significant military role for deterring regional aggression. Another example that we'll get to in greater detail in a few moments' time, in March 1996, the People's Republic of China began to intimidate Taiwan through a series of provocative ballistic missile tests on the eve of an election there. The United States sent a carrier strike group in through the Taiwan Straits, and that pacified the Chinese to the extent that it deterred them from escalating their aggression. Mentioned also the role of nuclear deterrence. If we look at the region, the United States nuclear security umbrella has meant that a number of countries that could otherwise have gone nuclear have chosen not to do so. I've already mentioned South Korea and Japan. Likewise, Taiwan at one point had an active interest in developing a nuclear weapons program. The United States was able to discourage them from continuing down that path. Australia down to the early 1970s likewise considered developing a nuclear capability and was convinced not to do so because of the provision for United States extended nuclear deterrence. The third point here is that if we look at Indo-Pacific Asia, this is a region that is, even in its name, a maritime space. The United States has played a greatly important role in providing the degree of stability within the system, the command of the naval and the maritime commons that has been necessary to make the Asia-Pacific region safe for continuing trade and economic development. We think of the vast majority of international trade is still conveyed via sea. The fact that the United States has been the uncontested maritime power has provided the military reassurance that has been necessary to enable trade to flourish. The fact that Japan is dependent on Middle Eastern oil, the United States controls key maritime choke points from the Strait of Hormuz all the way through to the Straits of Malacca, has been an important diffuse foundation for peace and security within the region. Now, this is a very broad brushstrokes overview, and I would be the last person to suggest that the United States has been perfect in providing peace and stability to the region, nor would I be in a position to suggest that that has been an act of altruism on the part of the United States. The United States has benefited from the role that it has played. The important point to note here, though, is that the Asia-Pacific has been relatively free of great power outright conflict for the past 40 years. It has also been a region that has seen incredible economic development, and that has to a degree rested on a security order that has been dominated by the United States, and a security order, importantly, that is now beginning to fray. So let's consider 4 forces that are beginning to transform the region, and I would suggest are making it more vulnerable to the threat of armed conflict. So the shifting Indo-Pacific security order. The first thing to note here, obviously, is the rise of China and the growing regional strategic instability that has been associated with the rise of China. If we cast our minds back, China, a country of 1.3 billion people, it's the world's most populous country. If we go back to 1978, which is typically taken as the beginning of the reform and opening period when China was joining the global economy, this was a period of time in which China was economically extraordinarily poor and relatively insignificant as a global economic player. By some benchmarks, China is the world's 2nd largest economy now. There are some benchmarks that even suggest that China has displaced the United States as the world's largest economy. With that growing wealth has come a corresponding growth in strategic ambition, an increasing tendency for China to adopt a policy of assertiveness in the region, whether it be in the East China Sea, whether it be in the South China Sea, whether it be in its land dispute with India. And as a result of the growth of Chinese power, an increasing degree of instability within the regional order, as China becomes more assertive and other states have to face the question of how they deal with a more assertive and revisionist China. Do they seek to accommodate China through, for example, granting concessions to them, granting them greater space in international institutions, or do they seek to push back against what they perceive as unwarranted Chinese aggression? So that's the first question. It's really the deeper driver of some of the other considerations that I'd like us to look at. So the first of these, the rise of China. The second is that as China is growing in strategic weight and in ambition within the system, as it is developing modern military capabilities that enable it, for example, for the first time in modern history, to develop overseas military bases in places as far away as Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. At the very same time that is happening, the United States relationship is becoming one that is moving away from wary partnership towards a pretty significant and strained level of rivalry. And again, the historical context here, from 1949 to 1972, the United States and China were estranged from one another. They were direct adversaries in the Korean War. Yet from 1972, the interest that both had in balancing the Soviet Union led to a degree of first diplomatic reconciliation and then increasingly strategic cooperation. That period of cooperation that began in the early 1970s and extended at least to the end of the Cold War into the early 1990s is now definitively over. In statements from both governments, these are countries that now officially identify one another as their chief strategic adversaries. What is notable about this relationship is that for a long time, this was a rivalry that played out in the military realm. That, for example, you had situations of not conflict between these countries, but incidents, for example, in early 2001, there was a spy plane incident of a United States spy plane being forced down in China. Likewise, in 2009, there were also isolated military tensions between these two countries. What we're now beginning to see is full spectrum strategic competition, including extending to areas where these countries previously cooperated. And the big example of this, and something that is a trend that the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated, has been the idea of an increasing pressure to economically decouple these countries' two economies from one another. The United States and China remain enmeshed in mutually beneficial economic ties, but these are becoming to be seen by both sides as security liabilities rather than simply mutually beneficial economic relationships. These are two countries now that are conceiving themselves as strategic competitors, and that as a result are beginning to force other countries to ask questions about where they sit within the increasingly contested strategic space. In particular, for countries like Japan, like Australia, that have historically depended upon a great and powerful friend in the form of the United States to provide them with a degree of security within the international system, they are now being forced to confront some extremely serious and pressing strategic questions. I've talked about here on the slide the idea of alliance security dilemmas. And the alliance security dilemma is essentially the question, if you're a junior ally to a country like the United States, you potentially fear one of two possibilities. The first is the fear of entrapment, the fear that a deterioration of the United States' relationship with China, or perhaps a further deterioration of its relationship with North Korea, will drag a junior ally into a conflict that it would rather avoid. In Australia, we have been talking for the last 10 to 15 years about the so-called China choice. Do we choose to realign ourselves with our greatest economic partner, that is China, or do we stick to our alliance with the United States, even if that might eventually draw us into a conflict with China? But if there is one fear that is the fear of entrapment, a fear that has grown significantly under the Trump administration in particular has been the fear of abandonment. What if there is a situation in which the United States does not make good on its commitment to protect its allies? So, for example, the tension between Japan and China with regards to what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands, would the United States alliance commitment to Japan necessarily extend to protecting Japanese territorial interests in the Senkakus? Similarly, if we're looking again, thinking from an Australian context, a perennial question for those of us in Australia is, would the United States be willing to prepare to support Australia in a situation where we were subject to, for example, economic coercion from China and turn to the United States for a degree of protection and diplomatic support? What's exacerbated this is obviously the growing domestic instability and introspection within the United States. As the United States has turned inward under an America First policy, there are increasing questions about the credibility of the US alliance commitment, and countries within the region that have traditionally outsourced their security to the United States are beginning to ask quite urgent questions. Can they rely upon the United States to make good on its security commitments? And if they can't, what actions do they need to then take to protect themselves against regional threats? So on top of the rise of China, a worsening of the US-China relationship, the increasing nervousness and uncertainty of allies within the region about the United States' commitment to them. The fourth element to this is that the Asia-Pacific order is becoming an Indo-Pacific order. The rise of India and China's pushing of the Belt and Road Initiative, that is the plan to encompass Eurasia and the broader maritime space of the Indian and Pacific Oceans within a Chinese massive mega infrastructure project. This is broadening the Indo-Pacific security environment in ways that we haven't previously seen. If we think about the region as one that has traditionally encompassed both those countries in maritime East Asia and also the United States, we've thought about in the 1970s calling this the Asia-Pacific region. Increasingly, Japan, Australia and the United States have sought to enlist India as a potential growing, economically dynamic, reliably democratic counterweight to rising Chinese ambitions within the region. As we've seen with recent increases in tension between China and India, these are two countries that have a historically problematic relationship dating back to a war between them in 1962. There are increasing efforts on the part of, for example, Australia has just recently concluded a comprehensive strategic partnership with India that hopes to encourage greater maritime cooperation between Australia and India. Many from 2007 onwards, under the first Abe administration government, talked about the idea of a democratic coalition, a quad, if you like, of Japan, the United States, Australia and India informally cooperating to balance and constrain China. The difficulty is that India has notoriously been independent in its foreign policy posture and is not going to be conscripted into an anti-China alliance. It is increasingly trying to prosecute its interests as an emerging maritime naval power player throughout the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans. So this is becoming a strategic environment that is more tense, that is more complex than it was previously, and it's becoming more crowded as we envisage the possibility of China, Japan, India and the United States simultaneously being powerful and assertive great powers within the region. At a minimum, this is making regional politics far more complex than it has historically been. But for those of us that are pessimists, and as someone who studies the use of force in international politics, I sometimes do tend towards the pessimistic side. We ask ourselves the question, is there a possibility that this great power conflict could move beyond mean tweets from Donald Trump, that it could move beyond diplomatic mudslinging, and that it could move to a shooting war in Asia? It's hard for us to imagine, given that there has been the absence of great power war in Asia in terms of great powers directly fighting one another since 1945. But just because something is hard to imagine does not mean that it is something that we should dismiss. What I would like to do for most of the remainder of this presentation is to give you three scenarios in which Asia might go to war, and more specifically look at what are the three most important regional flashpoints that could catalyse a confrontation between Asia's great powers. I should flag that I am a big fan of maps, so there'll be a few maps coming up. I hope you like maps as well. I think they're a really helpful way of giving us a sense of how strategy plays out within the region. But without further ado, I'll go to another PowerPoint without maps, but I do promise you the maps are coming. Okay, so question number one, how might Asia go to war over Taiwan? Three things I'd like to consider here. Why Taiwan, or as the People's Republic of China like to call it, Chinese Taipei, matters to China, why it matters to the United States, and why it matters to the rest of us. What is the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait? So let's first look at Taiwan's position within the international system, and I'm having a map here. I was just about to point to it, and then I realised the redundancy of doing so. So you'll forgive me, I'm a little used to actually presenting this enthusiastically in front of a crowd. Nevertheless, we'll make do. What I'd like you to do is to have a look at this map for a few moments and think about the location strategically of Taiwan. Some history up until the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Taiwan was claimed as a province by what was at that time the Qing dynasty. From 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was a colony of the Japanese Empire. From 1945 onwards, China reclaimed it, and in October 1949, as Mao Zedong triumphed on mainland China, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists withdrew to Taiwan, where they have remained ever since. So where does Taiwan fit in terms of the strategic jigsaw of the Indo-Pacific? Well, the first question is why Chinese Taipei, as the Chinese government refers to it, why does it matter for China? For China, it is worthwhile noting the narrative of modern Chinese nationalism is centred around the idea of a century of humiliation, that from the First Opium War, 1839 to 42, through to the lifting of the last unequal treaties with China in 1943, that this was a century of humiliation that did not really end until victory over Japan in 1945, and for the Chinese communists, the consolidation of Chinese communist rule in 1949. What's important from the Chinese perspective, ideologically and in terms of how they frame their nationalism, is they see that Taiwan is the last unreclaimed part of Chinese territory that they feel needs to be reincorporated back into China. So there's a very strong nationalist push to try to diplomatically isolate the government in Taipei as a prelude towards reclaiming it as an integral part of China. And in fact, in 2005, the Chinese specifically passed an anti-secession legislative act that said that China would consider all options, including the use of force, in order to bring Taiwan back into the fold. The map is useful also in that we need to consider what might tempt China to try to forcibly retake Taiwan. First of these is that Taiwan has now become a very wealthy and technologically advanced country in and of itself. There would be the economic dividends of conquest. But more importantly, if we actually look at where Taiwan is on this map, what we see is that Taiwan at the moment, when it is an informal security client of the United States, it's no longer a treaty ally, but it does have, through the Taiwan Defence Relations Act, it's a security dependent of the United States. What's significant about this is that Taiwan is effectively an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. It's absolutely pivotal in terms of its strategic significance. And while it is reliably anti-Beijing, it keeps China's maritime forces contained within the first island chain that is marked on the map. Conversely, if we envisage a scenario in which Taiwan becomes subject to Chinese direct rule once again, then suddenly China is able to use Taiwan to see it not as an American unsinkable aircraft carrier, but as a springboard for further power projection deep into the Pacific. From Taiwan, it is easy for China not only to aggressively impose on the Philippines, but it significantly complicates any attempt at US force planning with respect to protecting both Japan and South Korea. So in one fell swoop, China suddenly becomes far more significant as a strategic player within the international system. So there are powerful geopolitical motives for China to want to retake Taiwan. There are powerful and escalating nationalist motivations. There is also, as we've seen in the most recent election in Taiwan, a popular drift in Taiwan away from a traditional preference on the part of some of the population towards seeking reunification with China, towards a stance that is becoming much more heavily consolidated in favour of Taiwanese independence. So popular opinion means that Taiwan is potentially slipping from China's grasp, lending a degree of urgency to the struggle that China has to try to reclaim Taiwan back into the fold. The fact that unrest in Hong Kong is further fortifying Taiwanese resistance to the idea of incorporation to China further complicates this dynamic. From the United States perspective, Taiwan is not a treaty ally of the United States, but under the Defence Relations Act, the United States is committed to continuing to provide Taiwan with the high-end defence capabilities necessary for it to protect itself against the possibility of Chinese aggression. In 1996, the United States deployed naval forces in the Taiwan Straits in order to deter Chinese aggression. They see Taiwan's continued status as informally unrecognised, but nevertheless de facto independent, as being absolutely critical to their strategic posture within the region. So China and Taiwan's status matters decisively for the United States and China. Also, there is a sense on the part of US security planners, if they cannot reliably protect Taiwan from aggression, then the credibility of their alliances might crumble throughout the broader Indo-Pacific region. How this is developing at the moment is that what is clearly very evident is that both China and the United States are developing military capabilities that are potentially extremely destabilising, but are very much geared towards the possibility of a real military contest between the two over Taiwan. So, for example, China's strategy has been what is called anti-access area denial. That is, they are increasing their use or their development of ballistic missiles. They're increasing their deployment of sophisticated assets within the region, including their development of their own aircraft carrier capability, mainly with a view of making it too costly for the United States to intervene in Taiwan. China doesn't have to be in a position where they can militarily defeat the United States. They simply need to be in a position where they are sufficiently capable that they can deter the United States to impose costs on them sufficient that they will not want to intervene. The United States, in response, has developed what's been called the third offset strategy, which is essentially saying, well, we'll invest military capabilities that are designed to push back against Chinese military modernisation within the region. Disturbingly, this extends not merely to conventional capabilities, but also to developing offensive cyberspace capabilities to defeat potential Chinese thrust towards Taiwan, and also the improvement and further modernisation of US nuclear arsenal and its capacity to potentially defang China's nuclear capability. The broad message here is that while we may look at East Asia as being historically a place that, while filled with tension, is unlikely to see war, Taiwan has been a persistent point of tension within the region, and it is one that is becoming more rather than less dangerous. So have I scared you yet? If not, then I'm not doing my job. I'll introduce something even scarier now, which is Kim Jong-un. How the United States and China might potentially go to war. Another key issue here is the situation in the Korean Peninsula. And it's worth noting here, first, that the United States and China have some convergent interests on the Korean Peninsula. The United States and China, in addition to South Korea and Japan and even the Russian Federation, have an interest in preventing North Korea from consolidating its status as a nuclear weapons state within the international system. Through the six-party talks process, there was a significant and sustained attempt to try to deal with the problem of North Korea's continuing defiance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which North Korea was the first and only country to withdraw from in 2003. So there's a baseline level of interest here in trying to denuclearise North Korea. The difficulty here, though, and this is why this is an issue that is of urgent concern throughout the region, is first that there are significant differences in interest between the United States and China with respect to the future of the Korean Peninsula. The United States obviously has a treaty ally in South Korea and associated alliance commitments to protecting Korea. It also has, after its deployment in Japan, its second largest military deployment in Asia, and one of its largest in the world, is the tens of thousands of US forces that are permanently located in South Korea. At this stage also, if tomorrow a war were to break out between North Korea and South Korea, the United States would actually have operational command over both United States and Korean forces in the event of conflict. So what are the big differences between the United States and the People's Republic of China? The United States remains technically at war with North Korea. An armistice was concluded in 1953, but there was never a peace treaty. These are two countries, North Korea and the United States, that have remained rhetorically at odds, despite Donald Trump's claim of having had love letters and a love affair with Kim Jong-un. Nevertheless, situation of persistent diplomatic tension between North Korea and the United States. Conversely, China sees North Korea as both an ally, but also a helpful and useful buffer against the possibility of the United States expanding and is consolidating control over potentially in future a united Korea, which would be right there sharing a buffer, sharing a border with the People's Republic of China. If we go back to 1950, why did the People's Republic of China enter the war on North Korea's side? Because General MacArthur was pushing up and threatening to completely conquer all of the Korean Peninsula. When China goes to war, it often goes to war, as it did going all the way back to the 1894-1895 war between Japan and China. It goes to war over the stability of the Korean Peninsula. Final thing to note there is that if the North Korean regime were to collapse, that this would lead to a huge flow of refugees from North Korea into China. So all other things being equal, the Chinese are critically invested in keeping North Korea and Kim Jong-un in power. The United States has at times in the past expressed the desire for regime change. The issue and the question that plays out in the context of North Korea is that the United States faces a significant and growing credibility problem in the development and maturation of a North Korean nuclear arsenal. North Korea is now very, very close to having a credible nuclear deterrent against the United States. To get there, it needs three things. It needs a needs an atomic or it needs a nuclear warhead, they've been able to develop that. It needs a long-range delivery vehicle to be able to get a nuclear payload to the United States, and North Korea now has that as well. It needs finally a re-entry vehicle to ensure that a nuclear tipped missile does not burn up in the atmosphere and that it remains therefore militarily effective. And they are working on that. So they've got 2.5 out of 3 things that they need. Why does that matter, and why does it mean that the North Korean nuclear challenge is of significance for everyone who is invested in peace in East Asia? Well, the reason is that the North Korean development of a nuclear capability has 2 motivations. The first is to deter a direct attack from the United States. This is something that the Korean regime has historically feared, and this is a fear that has not been alleviated by, for example, in 2002, the United States, including North Korea, as part of its axis of evil in President Bush's State of the Union speech in 2002. At the same time, though, the North Korean nuclear interest is one of being able to threaten the United States and in so doing discourage it from continuing its role as senior ally to both South Korea and Japan. In so doing, what the North Koreans are hoping to do is to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea and Japan as allies and unbundle and disintegrate the credibility of the entire United States strategic posture within the region. Why this matters is that this is a threat, therefore, that diplomatically potentially threatens to undo the entire strategic order within the region. It's why, for example, there is an ongoing diplomatic push to try to advance North Korean denuclearization. Where we stand at the moment is that efforts at denuclearization have comprehensively failed. President Trump's audacious attempt at summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, trying to develop a personal rapport with him, has failed. North Korea is now resuming ballistic missile tests. This is a direct strategic threat to Japan. It's a direct strategic threat to South Korea. And it is playing out in a situation in which China lacks the capability, but also increasingly the inclination to rein in North Korea as a wayward ally. This is a structural tension that has been with us since going back at least the start of the first Korean nuclear crisis in 1993 to 1994, but it has never been more perilous, and it is a situation that worsens by the day as North Korea's nuclear capability becomes ever more credible as a threat to the United States and its regional allies. Are you worried? We've gone Taiwan as a threat to the international system and the security challenge. We're looking at Korea, which is uncomfortably close if you're looking at this in Japan. Final issue that I want to raise, which is, again, an opportunity to play around with maps, which is always fun. So looking at the question of energy security and maritime security in the region. And there are really 3 points of conflict here. The first of these is the South China Sea dispute. If we look here, this is a map that displays what the Chinese refer to as the 9 dashed line. And the 9 dashed line essentially is a posture or a position that China has asserted of saying that the South China Sea in its entirety is legitimately subject to Chinese sovereignty. Now, in so doing, they have opened up a host of maritime territorial disputes with other countries in the region, including the Philippines, including Vietnam. There's even the Natuna Islands that are contested between China and Indonesia. The significance of this is that China is increasingly asserting that they are projecting power throughout the region. They are developing artificial islands that increasingly possess small-scale military installations as a means of asserting their power under international law, to say this is an area over which we claim jurisdiction. Final thing to note, again, I did warn you that I do love maps. If we look at the island of Hainan, this is where China is developing significant naval bases in order to be able to project military power throughout the region, including nuclear-capable submarines, so that they have a more effective way of maintaining their that leg of their nuclear triad as a deterrent against the United States. So why does this matter? Well, this is a part of the world that is significant for a number of claims that have been made in terms of its possibly hosting. The geologists indicate that both oil and gas reserves are substantial in this region at a time when China is rapidly industrialising, a whole host of other countries are rapidly industrialising, and there is an extraordinary hunger for energy resources within the region. So it matters in terms of the resources that it might possess, who asserts effective maritime claims within this area. It matters also in that the Chinese often make this as a rhetorical claim. They say, look, the 9 dashed lines encompassed area, the South China Sea, matters for us because we need to control this the same way the United States is militarily dominant in the Caribbean. One of the points of difference, though, there is that if we look at the significance of the South China Sea as a maritime thoroughfare for trade within the region, the vast majority of Australia's export trade goes straight through the South China Sea. Admittedly, a large part of it to China, but also a significant part to Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan as well. So there is a significant strategic investment in trying to ensure that freedom of navigation remains within the area. As China develops its military capabilities, as it starts to build up the bases on the artificial islands that it has established, what it is doing is developing a capability to engage in increasingly assertive, even coercive claims in this area to dominate it at the potential expense of other states that have an interest. An example of this is that when the International Court of Justice concluded a maritime territorial claim in favour of the Philippines rather than in favour of China, China simply ignored this observation entirely. The United States is in a weak position, incidentally, to contest China's position on this, given that the United States is not a signature to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That being said, what is notable, again, is if we're looking at flashpoints within the region, South China Sea is a key area where a multitude of states have significant interest. China has picked this as an area where it will consolidate its power, and it raises a critical question of the degree to which China can or should be opposed in its expansion within the region. Another illustration of why this is important, the United States is a treaty ally with the Philippines. Several years ago, the Obama administration, President Obama was asked, does the treaty obligation to protect the Philippines extend to islands that are being contested between China and the Philippines? President Obama's response was uncharacteristically lacking in tact, where he said, look, the United States is not going to go to war over a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea. That's something that the Philippines have never forgotten, and it's partially contributing to the uncertainty and insecurity that has led to Duterte trying to pivot from the United States, increasingly leaning towards China as an ally. ASEAN, the Australian, Freudian slip there, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have tried to develop a Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, a protocol through the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation to try to bring China into a code of conduct in managing tensions within the region. That so far has failed. So you've got a flashpoint here very clearly. While we're on the maritime front, again, closer to home, looking at, again, China's behaviour with respect to contested claims over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, also increasingly their effort to extend what's known as an air defence identification zone throughout areas that are claimed by South Korea and Japan as well. If you're a student of history, you'd say this isn't surprising. What China is doing is what every great power has done historically, which is that they have sought to try to project their military power, to try to project their territorial claims to the immediate near abroad, regardless of the interests of states they perceive as weaker in doing this. So every country, every great power has historically done this, but there's a certain degree of urgency that is developing now that this is leading, for example, to clashes between China and the Japanese Coast Guard over these kinds of issues. The final area where this assumes a degree of global significance is if we look at China's expanding maritime horizons here. Again, I'd like it to be said I'm not necessarily picking on China, but simply observing that the rise of China is dominant as a story within the region, and it is implicated in a large number of the potential flashpoints that could lead to war. What we see here is this is an illustration of Japan's sea lines of communication between Japan, the home islands, and key energy reserves in the Middle East. And what we see on this front is that part of the Belt and Road Initiative is that China is beginning to develop significant, potentially dual-purpose military capabilities and bases that it will be developing in this area. Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, the base that's being built there is the only military base that China is developing up to this point. But if we look at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, if we look at the Gwadar port where China is developing infrastructure, what we see is that yes, these are there to facilitate increased trade, but they also could in future be nodes of Chinese diplomatic or perhaps even military influence within the region. China's horizons are expanding. This is occurring at a time when India is increasingly nervous. And it also is significant because if you look at the map, choke points, for example, the Strait of Malacca, these are areas that are vitally important to China as it becomes dependent on energy reserves from the Middle East, East Africa, and also, must be said, mineral reserves from northwestern Australia. These are critical to China. They're also critical to Japan. So the question then becomes, how do we develop a security order that effectively addresses the concerns of major Asian powers, but that does so in a way that is unlikely, or less likely to lead to conflict? I've canvassed 3 different flashpoints in the region that could potentially lead to armed conflict. Contestation over Taiwan, the ever-ongoing North Korean nuclear crisis, and a series of maritime territorial disputes with China at the centre, but that are critically important to the region as a whole. What solutions do I offer? Well, you'll have to come to the University of Queensland to find out what solutions I offer. But in the meantime, what I'd like to give you is a sense of 5 possible futures for international order in the Indo-Pacific. The first and the least likely is that nothing changes. This is an idea that says that what we will see is a persistence of United States primacy within the region. How could that potentially transpire? Well, one is the power of incumbency. I noted at the start that the United States' position as the dominant actor in the region is multidimensional. It rests on diplomacy. It rests on forward military bases. The United States is economically entangled with other countries within the region, and it has been relatively successful in encouraging the spread of democracy, at least among its key security clients. So the strong argument there is saying that the United States has a very strong advantage, and in addition, that there is sufficient regional consternation, sufficient regional worry about China's role in the international system, that it means that allies will prefer to stick with the United States than potentially to pivot towards greater security dependence and engagement with China. The final issue here, as you will be very familiar, is that there remains continuing controversy over efforts to redefine the peace clause within the Japanese constitution to enable Japan to adopt a more militarily assertive role in the region. So again, all of these forces are forces of inertia that suggest the United States may remain the dominant power in the international system. I nevertheless think that that is unlikely. This system was on shaky ground even before the election of President Trump, and is likely to be a system that, having been undermined and destabilised by Trump's America First diplomacy, will potentially be fragile even in the event of Donald Trump not succeeding in re-election in 2020. Another possibility is the possibility of a peaceful power transition from the United States to the People's Republic of China. This might seem to be an uncertain and unlikely possibility, but it's not one that can be entirely discounted. When the Obama administration first came to office in 2009, there was briefly talk of the idea of what was called a G2 world, of saying that the United States and China need not be adversaries. They do not have any territorial conflicts or disputes between them. They are economically enmeshed with one another. In fact, it has been suggested that the United States and China might informally draw a line right down the middle of the Pacific, saying that China can be dominant in East Asia and the United States will maintain its dominance in both Europe and also the Americas. This is the formula for a peaceful power transition from the United States to China. And again, I think this is an unlikely outcome. And I think it's an unlikely outcome for two reasons. The first is that historically, great powers aren't good at peacefully giving up power. There is a significant degree of discussion among international relations strategists as saying that the United States should and must accommodate China's increasing ambition within the international system. The United States has shown no appetite to do so. Its third offset strategy and its more recent efforts at military modernisation suggest instead a desire to double down on its power and influence within the region. But most importantly, what is notable is that a peaceful transition of power from American to Chinese predominance would mean that other countries within the region would also have to acquiesce to the prospect of Chinese dominance. That's something that successive administrations in Japan have proven to be very reluctant to do so. It's also, it must be noted, and again, the case that I'm most familiar with, my own country, Australia. Australia is deeply concerned about a whole host of challenges that are presented by the rise of China to preeminence within the region. We are particularly concerned, for example, in Australia, at China's increasing influence in the South Pacific and what that might mean for Australian security. And indeed, what's notable about Australia's behaviour with the rise of China is the degree to which Australia is actually encouraging greater United States military deployments in Australia as a means of hedging against the rise of China. A huge initiative that Australia has sponsored is to try to also increase defence cooperation with Japan to guard against the prospect of Chinese dominance. So a peaceful power transition from an era of American dominance to an era of Chinese dominance is also not particularly likely. Third possibility that has been canvassed by Hugh White, who is an eminent strategic thinker in Australia, and a number of others, is the idea of an Asian concert of power. The idea here would be to model Asia's future on what Europe looked like in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, when for at least a generation, the dominant powers in Europe at the time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also Britain, France, Prussia and Russia, were able to collectively resolve not to go to war with one another, not to interfere in each other's domestic affairs, and to actively cooperate to preserve the peace and prevent small conflicts from escalating into a more general war. And some have suggested that this might be a model for peace in the Asia-Pacific, or indeed the Indo-Pacific region. That if you had, for example, a top tier, what we'd call the adults table in international politics of Japan, the United States, China, India, and possibly in the future Indonesia, that these powers would cooperate between one another and that they would essentially ensure that localised conflicts didn't get out of hand, and that they would work to essentially subordinate the interests of smaller and middle powers in the interests of pursuing settlements that would lead to a more secure general peace for the international system. So this would be a model that would say, well, you persist with an effort to secure a peace in the Korean Peninsula, but it would be a peace in which the terms are developed by the great powers and then essentially imposed on the smaller powers. The great difficulty with this relationship is that 21st century Asia is not 19th century Europe. The idea that you can dictate terms as a larger set of dominant actors within the international system, that the great powers can tell the smaller powers what to do, is very unlikely in an era of wall-to-wall media communication and an era in which you have noisy, democratic, dynamic states that are not constitutionally oriented in a way where they can simply be dictated terms to by other states. Particularly Australia as a middle power, we're not particularly keen on the idea of a system that secures peace through silencing the voices of smaller and medium-sized powers. A fourth possibility might be the idea of a balance of power Asia. And what would this look like? A balance of power Asia would be one essentially in which a long protracted Cold War might play out between the United States and its allies in one camp versus China and an expanding portfolio of allies in another. And this is a scenario that most strategists in the region are very fearful of, are very keen to avoid. but that does nevertheless look distinctively possible within the international system that this might play out. And this would be a world in which peace would rely on the continuing existence of a stable nuclear balance of power between the United States, China, Russia, and other nuclear armed actors within the international system, but it would be one characterised by persistent and increasing diplomatic competition, by disinformation warfare, and perhaps even limited cyber aggression on the part of both states, and in a situation in which smaller states would be forced to choose and definitively align themselves with larger security patrons in the expectation of persistent tension within the international system, and in the hope that nuclear and conventional deterrence would do what they did in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is to secure a delicate balance of terror between two mutually opposed camps. Not a particularly attractive option, must be said, but then again, international politics, often the key to happiness in life is to have modest expectations. The final point that I want to conclude on is that I've mapped out 4 different scenarios already. There are other optimistic scenarios. For example, the ASEAN have sponsored the idea of a larger Indo-Pacific security community that would define security, primarily looking at non-traditional security threats like climate change and looking to find ways in which we could cooperate to address issues, whether it be climate change, pandemics, or other non-traditional security challenges. I do want to conclude on the note of saying I've listed 5 possible futures for international order in the Indo-Pacific. We need to be mindful, and if this is the one message that you take from this presentation, I will have done my job, which is we need to be mindful of the real risk of great power war in Indo-Pacific Asia, even if no state necessarily wants war. The great challenge, the enduring challenge in international politics is as follows. Most states want peace, but they want peace on their terms. And what is notable about the world that we live in at the moment is that there are a variety of non-traditional threats that are pushing us towards greater international cooperation, and yet we are not seeing nearly as much cooperation as we would hope for and expect. At the very same time, every nuclear armed state in the international system is modernising its nuclear arsenal. The North Korean case study illustrates that nuclear weapons are now a 75-year-old technology. They are increasingly within the reach of even relatively poor states within the international system. And what we are finally finding is that there is a sustained arms race in the international system. There is a sustained increase in international tension. And there is very much the real possibility that any of the flashpoints that I have considered will potentially break out into armed conflict. The key point here is that peace is not something that magically happens. Peace is not something that can be outsourced to being the byproduct of mutually beneficial economic exchange. Peace is not something that automatically happens either, because a balance of nuclear terror ensures that states see war as too destructive to be able to engage in conflict with one another. War often happens as much due to neglect as due to malice, as much due to the failure of people to be able to seriously envisage the prospect of conflict and take proactive preventive measures in order to stop it. What I would hope in this presentation is that I have raised your awareness of the degree of insecurity and the reality of the risk of armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific. But more importantly, what I hope that I've done is to pique your curiosity and encourage you to come and study with us at the University of Queensland to make sense not only of these challenges, but also of the enormous opportunities that we have to not only proactively address these security threats, but to work together towards a more peaceful and prosperous future. Thank you, arigato, for listening, and I hope very much to see you very shortly at the University of Queensland. Thank you and goodbye.